So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be loved and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Students with King serves as the King Center's flagship engagement platform for elementary, middle, and high school students, highlighting the legacies of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and the impact of the 20th century American Civil Rights Movement. Our dynamic and interactive programming has reached over 1 million students worldwide. Our core learning programs introduce students to the philosophy of Kingian nonviolence, coined Nonviolence 365, and provide important lessons about how they can apply nonviolence in their immediate environments. Whether you're an educator who is looking for ways to bring the King legacy into your classroom, a student who wants to learn more about this powerful moral movement, or a parent who wants to get your child involved in character building and literacy development activities, Students with King is your one-stop shop for unique lesson plans, teaching resources, educational field trips, and other opportunities to engage with the history of the American Civil Rights Movement and its powerful leaders. We look forward to engaging with you and your students. Together we can build the next generation of compassionate, courageous, and conscientious leaders.
Hi, everybody. So glad we're here together virtually. My name is Cheryl Preheim. I'm an anchor with NBC News based out of Atlanta. Really honored to work often with the King Center and the great work they do, and love the Students with King program, and so happy that we get to be a part of it together here online today. There is a lot to look forward to today. Be ready with questions, because you are a big part of what we're doing. We want to hear from you, answer your questions, and hopefully you'll walk away today with a greater understanding and appreciation of many, many decades of service and sacrifice. We're here together today because of the commitment and vision of Mrs. Coretta Scott King to continue the work of her husband, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to continue the work for civil rights and nonviolence principles. She had the vision for the King Center in Atlanta, and the King Center, of course, is the hub for all of these programs that not only happen here in Metro Atlanta, but all across the world. In a lot of ways, she was thinking about you all when she wanted to develop and build the King Center, because she wanted to reach the young people, knowing that they were the crux of the civil rights movement and in generations to come would be the important carriers of the work that they were doing. So today we're going to learn a lot more about this incredible visionary, a woman who was selfless and so strong, a world changer, Mrs. King. And we're going to hear from an incredible expert on Mrs. King. Dr. Graves, want to show you a video a little bit about the person who will be joining us in just a moment.
The nonviolent movement for social change must be properly interpreted, as well as developing programs that will deal with the issues of today.
Dear Coretta.
Dear Coretta.
Dear phenomenal woman.
Dear Mother, I can still hear your voice, lifted in song. I can still see the warmth in your eyes and feel the gentle wisdom of your words.
You had a vision of the future that felt impossible to so many. But your faith, fortitude, and integrity laid the groundwork for it to become a reality.
Thank you, Mrs. Coretta.
For creating, for singing, for leading, for being.
Heal the wounded soul. There is a God.
You didn't just teach it, you lived it. You told your own story in your own words. When others spoke over you, you let your actions be a guide for those who chose to see.
You are glorious, not because you are perfect, but because life's imperfections taught you grace. Sharpen your compassion and your passions.
At this point, I feel even stronger, and I want you to know that you have my utmost support.
You stared down hate, stood firm in your beliefs.
Protected the small, prepared a place for those who were oppressed. You showed us that resistance is a discipline, integrity is a practice in empathy, and courage can be cultivated by each and every one of us.
When people decide to be free and they are united together in that effort, nothing can stop them.
You weathered storms, rebuilt from charred embers, conquered fear, and laughed a lot.
You told us that we could be anything and that our circumstances didn't define our greatness. Most of all, you taught us that our dreams matter. Dear Coretta.
Dear Coretta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That gets me every time. Dr. Graves joining us now, an expert on Mrs. Coretta Scott King. I love the line about her gentle wisdom and her vision that at the time felt impossible, but even being here live with all of these students shows that it was possible. It's happening today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And good morning to all of you. So happy to be here. And I know you called me an expert. I like to say I'm a lifelong learner.
Yeah.
As it relates to Mrs. King. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, your insight has taught me so much over the years, and you have such an incredibly unique perspective because you've done so much research, but there's a personal connection too. So maybe we start for all the students out there understanding how that connection and interest even started in your life.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. It's one of my favorite questions to answer. I became interested in Mrs. King when I was around 15 years old, in fact. And like most of the students, we learn about Martin Luther King Jr. in school, and it almost becomes routine. Every January, February, you learn about Dr. King. The information I didn't get in school was around Mrs. Coretta Scott King. And so it was during early January 2006, actually. So everybody can deduce from that how old I was if I was 15 in 2006. But my father actually forced me to watch this program on Democracy Now!, where they were showing clips of the Selma to Montgomery March. And in each of those clips, I kept seeing Mrs. King. And so as a young person, I had a question. Of course, I tell my students all of the time that you should always have a good research question that can lead you to the next level of insight. And so my question as a young person was, if Coretta Scott King was there, why didn't I know about it? And so I immediately went and got on my Internet Explorer, my little Windows 98 computer, and tried to find as much information as I could at the time about Mrs. King. And unfortunately, this was actually before she passed. She passed January 30th, 2006. And my research inquiry actually began early January. So at that time, there wasn't a lot of information about Mrs. King. So I went to my local library and tried to find all of the books that I could on Mrs. King. At the time, there were only children's books. And so I checked out all of the books that I could and would never really return them. I went to my school. My school had Mrs. King's autobiography that was released in the revised version of her autobiography that was released in the 90s. I checked that out of the school library, didn't return it for years, unfortunately. And when I actually did return it years later, the librarian was like, "We knew you took the book."
You took good care of it. There was a great purpose in you keeping it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's really where the journey started. It started with a question. And then, of course, I wrote a letter to Yolanda King, who was the oldest child of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. And, I put my phone number at the bottom of the letter. So students never underestimate the power of a letter and never underestimate the power of putting your phone number at the bottom of a letter. And her office called and they invited me and my family to Atlanta. And so the rest is history.
Wow. Incredible. It really stands out to me that you noticed there was information you were missing, that who is this woman? And we need to know her story too. And I hope everyone that's joining us, all the students joining us, start thinking about what questions do you have, like Dr. Graves, like what is it? Like what piece of a puzzle is missing for you that maybe we could help fill in the gaps? So be thinking about your question. You can put them in the chat so that we can ask them for you as well. But I was thinking about that because I've had the honor of getting to know Dr. Bernice King, daughter of Mrs. Coretta Scott King and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And she says so often people are so quick to talk about my dad, which I love and appreciate, but they really need to know more about my mom, because there was never a step that he took that she wasn't right there. And for every sacrifice he made, she made it, and so did the whole family. You can't really tell one story without the other. Is that the feeling here, Dr. Graves?
Oh, most absolutely. Dr. King and Mrs. King were so intellectually aligned in their lives. I mean, from their first date, if you will, Dr. King really recognized in the then young Coretta Scott that this is a dynamic woman that I have to have in my life. So certainly Dr. King and Mrs. King were intellectually aligned. They grew together in their partnership, even around, let's say, their commitment to nonviolence. As young students, they are committed to nonviolence as the theory of committed to nonviolence as a theory, but it's really, as young people, once they're kind of thrust into leadership within in the Montgomery bus boycott, that nonviolence really becomes a way of life for them, particularly when they understand that, this is a cause that they were willing to give their lives for. So certainly we cannot tell Dr. King's story. In fact, Dr. King's story would be incomplete if we did not uplift and amplify the role that Mrs. King played, not only in his life, but certainly in the human rights struggle and in broader world history. I mean, her story is absolutely indispensable. And I've always been one you mentioned gaps. I've always been one who's been attracted to what's not said. And so, as it relates to Mrs. King and other women within the African-American canon, if you will, I've always been attracted to amplifying and uplifting those stories.
Well, I was thinking as you were talking, Dr. Graves, that it's good for all the students joining us to think about the period of time we're talking about, late 50s, 60s. And this was a time of great struggle, civil rights movement, human rights, women's rights. And so the intersection of all those, to have such an incredibly strong, critical piece of the puzzle in this woman is significant in so many ways.
Absolutely. And it's important also when we think about this time in history, of course, the folks that we see as civil rights leaders, these are the grandchildren of formerly enslaved individuals. But when you look at the mid 19th going into the early 20th century, there were very clearly defined ideas about the roles of men and women. And so the public sphere, if you will, or the public world was seen as the responsibility of men, and the home sphere was seen as the responsibility of women primarily. So what you see in the example of women like Coretta Scott King, what you see in the example of women like Nannie Helen Burroughs and Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell, all of these heroines within the African American experience, they really transgress those boundaries, if you will. So they're not only, of course, home is a primary responsibility for them, but they also have very public roles, which was certainly daring acts at the time for women. So it's important for students to understand the context in which these women's activism was expressed.
Yeah, that's so important. I was thinking about for everybody who's watching and you're a student, maybe, in that teenage year and you feel like this is sort of an out of reach kind of a topic. It was young people that drove the movement. The video mentioned the march from Selma to Montgomery over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And you see old archival video, and there are children, on that bridge. There are women, there are men of all ages, but even those teenagers, Congressman John Lewis was so young at that time. So if they could see themselves in a role of, I could change the world in the decisions I make every day too, it's really amazing to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, these people were so incredibly young when they were thrust into leadership. You think about the Birmingham campaign, where you have students leaving school to participate in the movement. You think about Dr. King and Mrs. King, in fact, I mean, during the Montgomery bus boycott, they're in their mid-20s. But of course, their interest in contributing to the world didn't start when they were in their 20s. When we look at Mrs. King, she had always been a young person who was committed to this idea of contributing something to the world. And when you read her book, she talks about reflecting on these questions as a young person, thinking about what is it that I can do to help the world, to make the world better than the one that I inherited. So even as a young person, both Dr. King and Mrs. King were deeply reflective about the way in which they could contribute to the betterment of society. And certainly young people, right? Contribution doesn't have to be confined to a particular age group, right? You can contribute at any age.
No doubt. And I was thinking about how Mrs. King is a great example of taking a passion and using it to focus energy and resources into kind of a greater good. I mean, she made a lot of personal sacrifices, but she loved music. She was a musician. And so there were things maybe she did not do because she was committed to the movement, but she used music to fuel the movement as well. So I want students to think about what are their passions and how could they use that for the greater good. But maybe tell us a little bit about that part of Mrs. King's story.
Absolutely. That's a lesser known aspect of Mrs. King's story. The fact that she was in fact a performer. That was actually her dream in life. When she met Dr. King, she was at the New England Conservatory studying music, and that was really her trajectory. She wanted to be a singer, she wanted to be a performer. So when Dr. King showed up, it changed her plans, if you will. But Mrs. King was deeply committed to the arts, even when you look at the institutionalization of the King Center, building the King Center. Cultural arts was a big part of the King Center's programming. But when you look at Mrs. King's leadership within the civil rights movement, she pioneered what was called at the time freedom concerts, which is actually an idea that was borrowed, if you will, from the concerts that Paul Robeson used to do. But she really used the freedom concerts as sort of a public education effort where she was teaching about the civil rights movement, teaching about the African American experience through song and narration. And she used that platform to raise funds for the civil rights movement. So even though she wasn't able to have the kind of music career that she might have envisioned, she was able to live out some of that passion through the freedom concerts, and she made a remarkable contribution to the movement. But not only that, again, when we look at this, I'm a historian and a philosopher by nature, so I always look at what things mean within
Yeah.
context. She really did set a mold for how the arts could be used as a public education effort, right? So
Mhm.
not just merely for entertainment, but arts for the sake of being able to educate people about issues, educate folks about what was happening in the world. And so in many ways, Mrs. King was a trailblazer in so many areas of her life.
Yeah, and thinking about then as a young mother with four young children and the violence that they faced, and they did that together and never quit. But then the decision after Dr. King was assassinated, not to retreat, but to say, I want to learn anything I need to learn. I remember meeting her accountant who said that she walked into a room, even in her grief, even having now to raise four young children alone, being in the public eye, and the weight of the world really that she could feel, but saying, teach me everything. I want to learn because we have more work to do. And that says a lot too, because she used something she loved and was good at, but then she also really leaned into things that maybe didn't feel comfortable. But again, where would we be if she had not done that? It's really important to think about that too.
Absolutely. Mrs. King's building the King Center was a monumental effort. I would dare say that the King Center was probably one of the first institutions immediately after what we see as the modern civil rights movement, if we bracket the civil rights movement based upon, Dr. King's years of leadership. So the King Center really was in many ways, I believe, one of the first institutions to professionalize the study of nonviolence. Of course, Dr. King believed that nonviolence should become an area of study that's applicable to various areas of society. But Mrs. King really institutionalized that. And for students, when I say institutionalize, that means to build something, to make it available to a broader audience. And so Mrs. King's commitment to build the King Center was a monumental effort for a woman at her time. But I also think it's important to think about Mrs. King's contribution as a business leader, as an entrepreneur. Those are not terms that we typically associate, right? When we talk about Mrs. King, most of what you hear is the widow of, the wife of, but we never really talk about Mrs. King within the context of being a business leader. Within the context of being an entrepreneur. I mean, this is a woman who's starting an organization in the late 60s. She's providing jobs for folks in the community. When you talk about building the physical structure of the King Center, you're talking about contracts, right? That go to companies to help to build the center. So Mrs. King really was a forerunner as a business leader and an entrepreneur. But when you look at the history even of her parents, her father was an entrepreneur, right? So when you look at Mrs. King's life kind of from a long view, it's not a surprise some of the things that she was able to accomplish in her life. But her father, O.B. Scott, he started a grocery store. He did truck farming. So her father had an entrepreneurial spirit. And for the students, entrepreneurship means using your creativity, using your talents to contribute something to the world, creating something that the world needs. That's what having an entrepreneurial spirit means. And Mrs. King exemplified that throughout her life. So I think in addition to the wife of Martin Luther King Jr., of course,
Yeah.
we know the widow of Martin Luther King Jr., we have to assign also the respect of being a business leader and an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and she did that until her last breath. And that work carries on. It's why we're all here today
Absolutely.
together. And she instilled that in her children as well. And so there are so many layers to that. I think that's such a important and inspiring message for all the students joining us today, that everyone has that in them, something that they can contribute. And really important for everybody to know that you can make a difference. Problems seem so big, things maybe feel impossible, but there were things that may have felt impossible to Mrs. Coretta Scott King, but she said, no, I have to believe it's possible. And if I just do one thing, every step towards that, and then it becomes a possibility. I was thinking, and just students, just a reminder, if there's something, you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Put it in the chat. We want to make sure that we're answering what you have too, because I think what's kind of amazing is Dr. Bernice King often says she'll go back and listen to recordings of both of her parents and say it's almost like they knew what would be faced today. Like words that they spoke then could be applicable now. Tanya's writing in, it's because women, especially women of color, are marginalized and minimized worldwide. I'm glad women like Mrs. Coretta Scott King are now being recognized and celebrated for all of their contributions. No doubt about it, and much work to do, which is why we're here. Hello from Turkey. I'm glad we've got people from all over the world. Thanks for using the chat. Keep those coming. It's so great to hear from all of you. We want this to be interactive. But back to that point, Dr. Graves, about these principles are applicable today, no doubt about it. And even the principles of Kingian nonviolence, even in the classrooms day to day, or our lives day to day. I mean, that's why Coretta Scott King wanted this to continue. It's as if they knew what was going to be needed long after they were gone.
Absolutely. Dr. King and Mrs. King certainly saw the significance and the applicability of the philosophy and methodology of nonviolence for personal, social, and cultural transformation. And they really saw it as they phrased it in the 50s and 60s as, the most potent tool available for oppressed folks. If there's one, I know sometimes it can be overwhelming when students look at the 6 principles and the 6 steps, but one of my favorite when you talk about the principles is that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. That nonviolence really does take courage, right? It takes not being afraid to stand up for what's right. So even within one's school context, within one's classroom, how important it is to always stand up for what's right. And so that's one of the principles. When we look at the steps, the first step of nonviolence is information gathering. And so I think that's so important even for young people, that when things happen, before immediately responding, it's always important to gather the facts, to understand what's actually happening before one issues a response. I know sometimes it's easy when we see things happening to kind of just lash out or just kind of react, but it's always important to pause and say, okay, what are the facts here? What is the information I need so I can make an informed decision? So if students after this session today, if they don't remember anything else, remember one of the principles is that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And then the first step is information gathering.
It's such an important point because it takes incredible courage and strength not to lash out back, especially when that's coming towards you. And that was proven out in the civil rights movement. And that takes such strength. And I think we can't hammer that home maybe enough, because that example changed the world, and there's so much more change that's needed, but it was the starting point.
Yeah. I mean, that's why Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Nonviolence was so successful within the modern American civil rights context that he won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And so I think that's important, right? Because when you look at world history and you look at changes that have happened around the world, those changes have been brought about in some cases through violent means, through war, etc. And so the fact that Dr. King and the broader and their colleagues within the civil rights movement were able to apply this philosophy and methodology to create change in American society, it was absolutely monumental, and it's why he earned the Nobel Peace Prize.
With all the research you've done, you have taught me so much. Every time we talk, I learn so much more. So I appreciate that so much. Of all the research you've done, is there a point that either stood out to you or surprised you that you'd want to share with everyone joining us?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that's always stood out to me, again, as we mentioned earlier, was how young Dr. King and Mrs. King were when they were thrust into these leadership roles, the way in which they were able to commit their lives to something bigger than themselves. I mean, I think nowadays people can be committed to something, but giving your life, that's a whole other level. So the extent to which they were willing to sacrifice in their lives has always been a point that's been particularly intriguing to me when you look at how incredibly young they were, and then just the inordinate amount of courage that they had even as young people. When you look at the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956 and the Dr. King and Mrs. King, they're receiving threats and phone calls, their house is bombed, and the fact that they didn't retreat, that they stayed to see the movement through, it's always been incredible. And also the second piece, when we look at Mrs. King's legacy, Mrs. King was a trailblazer as a preservationist. And for young people, a preservationist is someone who preserves or collects historical artifacts. And so Mrs. King, from very early in her life, was committed to preserving and collecting historical artifacts because she knew future generations would need to benefit from these things. So the fact that she arranged for Dr. King's first speech as leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, she arranged for that to be recorded because she knew it was going to be important for future generations. So I think also the courage piece, the sacrificial pieces, but also the way in which Mrs. King collected and preserved history and archives that young people and people around the world can benefit from today. It's the reason why I was able to do research, right? Mrs. King was very intentional about collecting and preserving historical artifacts and papers and documents. And even today at the King Center, we maintain that tradition. Everything we do, we ensure that it's recorded and that we have a record of it for the archives, because someone 50, 100, 150 years from now will be able to benefit from what we're doing today.
That reinforces her as a visionary in so many ways, because think back then where you can't Google anything. It's not stored in the cloud. You don't have it on a hard drive. I mean, it really was having the foresight to say, I'm going to keep this letter from the Birmingham jail. We're going to keep that copy. We're going to document all of this. And then when there was the technology to back that up, we're going to make sure that it's there and distributed. I mean, you really almost like shudder to think what would have happened if we hadn't had those pieces of history, because we continue to draw on them. Like Dr. Bernice King would say, we can still draw on those words, actions, philosophies, and strategies in things the world faces today. That's such a great point you're making.
And it leads us to kind of the modern day project that we have, or partnership that we have with Microsoft. In fact, the Dear Coretta video that the students saw at the top of this program is the output or the result of a partnership with Microsoft to really amplify and uplift the significance of Mrs. King's legacy for the world. And so the Dear Coretta campaign is meant to do that. So there's two aspects of the campaign. A core aspect is really to create these digital interactive experiences that's available to students and teachers around the world. So the first part of that experience is called the King Center Timeline, which goes through about 70 years of history as it relates to the life and legacy of Mrs. King and the development of the King Center. And teachers and students can access that at timeline.thekingcenter.org. You can go to our website to get access to that. We also have resources available to help teachers teach the timeline in their classrooms. So a great follow-up to this call and I'm an educator, so I have to do this spiel, right?
Yes, you got it.
A great follow-up for the educators and the teachers on this call will be to go to our website, go to thekingcenter.org, or to get directly to the timeline, you could go to timeline.thekingcenter.org, review the timeline, but then also click educator resources so that you can bring those lessons and help walk your students through this interactive experience. And then recently, this year, in fact, in partnership with Microsoft, we were able to launch the Coretta Scott King Rose Gallery which is, the world's first 3D gallery on
Wow.
Mrs. Coretta Scott King. So again, students and teachers can access that at cskrosgallery.thekingcenter.org. Again, that is cskrosgallery.thekingcenter.org. Or you can simply go to the King Center's website, go to what we do, and you'll see a section that says virtual exhibitions, and you can explore all of that. But we are super excited about this 3D virtual exhibition where you can literally walk through the halls and follow Mrs. King's story and see her trajectory and contribution in a 3D format. So again, Cheryl, all of the content that Mrs. King was able to preserve, all of those preservation efforts enables us today to deliver these kind of digital historical interactive experiences for teachers and students and enthusiasts and learners around the world.
Yeah, it's good. It makes you want to just go on the website, look around, and just keep in mind that we wouldn't be seeing any of that without her vision.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What other efforts are happening to just help keep her legacy alive and to continue the work? Because I know it's kind of twofold, because the importance of remembering and keeping a legacy alive is the foundation to making sure the work goes on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So Mrs. King founded the King Center as a living memorial. It's a programmatic nonprofit. So the way she phrased it, she did not want the King Center to be a dead monument, if you will. She really wanted to be full of, as she would say, all of the life and vitality that was his, referring to Martin Luther King Jr. So today, the King Center is a programmatic nonprofit. We have programs that we offer. We have exhibition spaces as well. So if folks come to the King Center, you can see our exhibition spaces. But in terms of programming and how we engage with the community, under my purview at the King Center, there are 7 areas. We have, of course, our library and archives area, which I spoke about just a few moments ago, or spoke about some of the initiatives coming out of that area. We also have, of course, the Students with King programming, where we're reaching young people around the world with these virtual experiences and on-site experiences where students can learn and really gain more information about Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta Scott King, and the Civil Rights Movement. But not only that, how they can participate as well. We have a Leadership Academy, which is a cohort-based model focusing on leadership development, focusing on character development, and as well as business and technology. We also have our Nonviolence 365 training and education area, where we provide training in nonviolence to people around the world, to corporations, organizations, schools, teachers, etc. So that's our Nonviolence 365 programming. We also have our Fellows and Interns program, which is designed to help cultivate a cadre of thinkers and scholars, focusing specifically on social justice, public life, and also religion. We're also going to be soon launching an interdisciplinary learning program where folks can take courses at the King Center to learn more about what Dr. King's philosophy looks like at the intersection of various other areas. So for instance, Dr. King in economics, nonviolence and neuroscience. So we're really excited to be able to launch that soon. And so, yeah, we have
So
a
much,
variety.
yes.
We have so much at the King. So we have something for the whole person. We have things for the whole family. So we're doing a lot at the King Center.
I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us. We have a huge audience right now, and we appreciate it. Rose just joined in as an intern studying directly under Mrs. King, who is also from Alabama. It's been my dream to help establish a memorial for Mrs. King in Alabama near her hometown. I'm so proud that she is from Alabama. Rose, that's a great addition. I'm so glad. And that would be significant and absolutely warranted to have that. That's so cool. So yeah, keep the chat active if you want. I want to keep the conversation going, and thanks to everyone who's being a part of this. I was just thinking for the students who are on with us, who are teenagers, Dr. Graves, what do we know about Coretta Scott before she was Mrs. Coretta Scott King, even maybe before that introduction in college and those first dates led to the partnership and change in the world that we know of today. What do we know about her at the age of maybe a lot of the ones who are with us today on this call?
Yeah, there's a great video where Mrs. King talks about how she was something of a tomboy growing up, and she could be quite rambunctious, and then she grew into being a nice Southern young woman. But Mrs. King was what we might call a very plucky youngster. She had a lot of energy. She was very industrious, and so I'm throwing out these SAT vocabulary words for the students so you can get ready, right? So look up the word industrious. So she was a person who was very hard. Industrious means someone who's very hard working. She was the daughter of parents who really invested a lot in her future growth. Her mother really pushed education. Her mother said, you're going to get a great education if I don't have but one dress to put on. So her mother was really pushed the importance of education. From her father, you really get, as I mentioned earlier, all of those lessons about business and entrepreneurship. So her parents really contributed to her growth in a remarkable way. But Mrs. King, I would say, as a young person, was someone who was very curious. And she was always a thinker. And I think it's important for young people to be thinkers, that you're not just in the world, moving through the world and things are just happening, but you have a brain, you have a mind where you can think about solutions, where you can think about reflect on what's happening. And so as a young person, Mrs. King was really energized with an incredible amount of curiosity about the world she was in, and what her place and what her place was in that world. So yeah, again, Mrs. King's early life is an interesting story, and I encourage all of the students and teachers out there to please get the King Center's recently released a children's book version of Mrs. King's autobiography, which you can pick up from the King Center's bookstore. You can go on our website as well. So I think that book is a remarkable way to be able to translate Mrs. King for young people. But she was a young person, just like the young people are that's watching this program.
I think that's a great point to maybe end on, because I think whoever is with us today, think about those things in your life, and just what asking questions, being a critical thinker, not just taking information and just consuming it, but thinking it through, wanting to know more about that, and being curious, like you're saying, and working hard, and appreciating education, even when it's hard to roll out of bed in the morning sometimes. But to go to school for many people in the world is really a luxury.
That's right.
Take that for granted, and the importance of education in their lives, and why they have continued even after their passing, and the King families continued pouring into the education of people all over the world. I love that we have people all over the world today, because that is a perfect reflection of the work that they did, that it reached in civil and human rights all over the world.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts? I mean, we could talk for hours, and I hope someday we can, but any final thoughts for today that you'd want anyone listening to take away as they, get off this call, but really think about this conversation and how it might impact them, throughout the rest of their lives?
Yeah, certainly. No, that simply that Mrs. King was one of the greatest leaders, greatest human rights leaders, and not just civil rights, but human rights leaders of the 20th century. And that this program today really is an outgrowth and evolution of her vision. Mrs. King had a background, in fact, in elementary education, and a lot of people don't know that. So she was an educator and a teacher to her core. And so what we're doing today really honors that aspect of her legacy. And I want all of the young people to know that you have the power and the capacity to make a great contribution to the world. And start by making a contribution within the context of your family, within the context of your classroom, within the context of your school culture, really contributing to positivity in your environment. So thank you all for sharing with us today. Again, please look at we have a wealth of educational resources on the King Center's website. Again, we talked about the timeline and the educational resources that teachers can use. We talked about the Coretta Scott King Rose Gallery. So just go to the King Center's website and go to what we do so you can really get engaged with the work that we're doing.
Well, Dr. Graves, thank you for the work you do every day and for the time today, for all of your research, and to continue that education and work of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. I love your message about be courageous so that you can be love. And that can start with just whomever is standing in front of you that day in a classroom, in a school, in a grocery store, in your house. And it's an impact that we all can make every day. And there's a lot of hope in knowing that we can all make a positive impact in the world every day. So Dr. Graves, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I want to throw up a QR code because we want to make sure that you all can give a lot of input so that we can continue to serve students all over the world the best way possible. The King Center is so committed to this work. So it's really easy. If you just grab your phone, scan this QR code, it would take you right to a survey where you can share about your experience. You can share suggestions. We'd love to hear ways that you feel like we can continue to build on these programs, and just love to know more about your experience. And we just can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us today. Means a lot that you would log on, be part of this, and to continue the great work and the great legacy of the King family, from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Mrs. Coretta Scott King to all of their children and everyone who's helped in the years since. Artists, thank you for being with us. Thank you, Lang, appreciate that. Live from Uganda. Hey, everybody. I love seeing everybody from all over the world. So thanks, everybody. Again, I'm Cheryl Preheim from NBC News, 11 Alive News in Atlanta. Honored to be with you all today. Look forward to seeing you again. We're going to close out with a video. Be love, everybody. Have the courage to be love, and have a great day.
We join hands with people around the world who yearn for peace. We are tired of other people making decisions for us. We want to control what happens to us. We want to write our own history. We want to tell our own story because we feel that we know it better than anyone else.